To the Grants for Youth Services webinar. My name is Beth Yates, and I am the Children's Consultant here at the Indiana State Library in our Professional Development Office. I'll be the host and the question moderator for today. And our presenter this morning is Angela Fox. She's the Public Library Consultant in ISL's Library Development Office. So before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping items for you. First of all, if you have any questions during the webinar, just type them in that chat box on the upper left-hand side of your screen, and I will be watching it, and I'll get your questions to Angela as soon as there's a good opportunity. And then I imagine there will also be time near the end for questions too. If you have sound issues during the webinar, please see the sound issues box. It's just below the chat box on the left side of the screen. If there is a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat box, and global means that everyone is experiencing it, not just you. If you're unable to resolve the sound issue you're experiencing, we are recording the webinar and you can watch it offline at a later date. The session today is worth 1 LEU, and your certificate will be available for download at the end of the webinar. So please note that if you're watching an archived recording of this presentation, information on how to obtain your LEU is in the video's description on YouTube. But everybody else watching live, you stick around, stay logged in, and we'll get you that downloadable certificate. As I mentioned, today's webinar will be recorded. After the webinar has been transcribed, it will be available on the Indiana State Library's archived webinars page, and we try to get those up within 30 days of the live webinar. For weekly updates on upcoming trainings and to learn more about what's happening in libraries across the state, please subscribe to the Indiana State Library's e-newsletter, The Wednesday Word, and check our continuing education website for other professional development opportunities. All right, let's get started, guys. I am now happy to turn the presentation over to Angela Fox of the Indiana State Library's Library Development Office. So Angela, once we get your presentation pulled up, share your screen, you can take it away.
Is it sharing?
Yeah, it will. It's thinking.
Okay, want to make sure.
Just make sure it gets pulled up. I see it spinning here. And it's still spinning for me. Try one more time. Maybe go down to this right here. Sorry, everyone.
Close out of that.
Yeah, close out of that and try it one more time. And then share.
Maybe I didn't hit that the second time.
There we go.
Oh, look at that.
Now we've got it.
If you hit the right buttons, it pulls up.
All right.
Who knew?
Here's Angela, everybody.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. Unless you're watching this webinar, in which case this is your thank you from the past. As Beth said, I'm a public library consultant here at the State Library, and my big focus is things like federal projects, so things like the annual report, but also LSTA grants. So I'm very passionate about grants. It's one of my focal points here. And I also tend to be passionate about public libraries and particularly children's librarians because I have a history with them. I spent 15 years in a public library prior to coming here, and the last 3 of those were as a youth librarian at a very busy branch. So I've seen some of the things that our public library youth librarians are facing firsthand, and I have nothing but respect for them. As I said, it's a topic I feel passionate about, and I could talk for hours about it, and I have little less than 45 minutes or so. So I'm going to try to really break the content of this down into 2 major focal points so that it's a little bit more structured and a little bit less of my frenetic shouting at you. So the first part, we're going to focus on where to find grants. I'm going to try to give you some concrete examples, some of which you may know and think, well, that one's obvious. Hopefully I'll point out some you haven't seen before, but also give you some tips on maybe just how you can seek them out and ferret them out on your own. And then the second half is really going to be the hows of getting those funds. So hopefully you've located some positive opportunities and you're ready to sit down and tackle that application. So there are some tips that you can keep in mind that might keep you from disqualifying yourself out of the gate, or would make your application memorable, but in a good way. So that's kind of the format that we're going at today. As Beth said, if you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And if you think of something after the seminar, my job is public library consultant, so by definition, I like to talk. So please, I like to consult, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and my contact information will be included afterwards. So I'm going to start off right out of the gate by saying that if you are looking for library grants and you are actively looking for library grants, you may be really limiting your options. Most of the grants that people are getting at libraries are not actually specifically geared towards libraries. What you're seeing on your screen right now is a word cloud, if anyone remembers when those were very trendy, but I generated that by taking a bunch of purpose statements from small local grants, feeding it into the word cloud and seeing what was generated. And like most word clouds, the larger the letter or the larger the word, the more often it came up. And if you look at this word cloud, libraries appears down towards the left, kind of center, and it's a decent size, but the ones you're really seeing are community and impact and learning and innovation and opportunity. And these are all keywords that I think as children's librarians you are very familiar with. So I just want to stress, again, when you're looking for grants, don't feel like you have to look for a library grant. You may be looking for a community improvement grant or a community innovation grant. Community is a big one, as you'll see. So with that in mind, it just kind of broadens your scope. It's not an accident that I fed small local grants into that word cloud generator, because the one thing I try to stress again and again when I talk to people about grants is that your best bet is to look small and to look local. I mean, it's really exciting to think about filling out a grant application at a national level and coming back and telling your director, hey, no biggie, but I just got $3 million. But there's very few people who actually get to have that experience. And if you think that's the only way to do grants, you're probably setting yourself up for some disappointment. So most of you do recognize that there are a lot of local grant opportunities, and there may be some you don't even realize are out there. So in the first column, what you'll see is public service organizations, social organizations. These are, of course, national organizations, but you may have a local chapter nearby. And that is a great place to start looking. It can be kind of difficult to track down information sometimes. If you go online, you may find that they have a lot of general information about the organization, but only offer time and date of meeting for your local chapter. And this is where you kind of have to be brave and go out there and possibly contact someone, email them, call them, and just explain, hey, I'm looking for possible funding for this cool project I have. I know that your organization has a history of providing funding for good community projects. Is this something that you might be willing to help with? No one's going to get angry for asking if you do it in a polite way, so it's worth reaching out to them. The second one, community foundations. I feel like I did it a disservice here. I feel like it should be in neon colors, maybe add some of that PowerPoint graphics, have it like entering, bouncing on the screen, spinning around, fireworks going off around it, because this is, if someone said, what is the #1 source of grant funding for libraries, where should I look? I would say, if only one thing, it would be community foundations. By far and away, this is where most people report getting their grant funding. So if you're not aware of who your local community foundation is or where to find them, you'll see on the screen a couple of really easy ways to figure that out. There is a Grantsmanship Center website, which, yes, it is a subscription site, but there are some features that you can access for free, and one of them is a community foundation finder, which is kind of nifty. Also, there's this miraculous Google search you can do where you put in your county name, your state, and foundation and hit enter, and 99% of the time it's going to steer you in the right way. If you put in Adams County plus foundation, you're going to find it's called the Adams County Foundation or Community Foundation. If you put in Miami County and Community Foundation, it's something like Northern Indiana Community Foundation. So you might want to double check and make sure you know who you're asking, but it's super easy to find out what the community foundation in your area is. And they do tend to give a lot of money because community foundations they work like charities in that they solicit money from the public, but then they turn around and they act like foundations in that they give that money to worthwhile projects. So you're really seeking out public funding to go for your project. And then, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say we have a comment here from Julie Wendorf who says that their community foundation just fully funded the replacement of all of their AWE computers for just under $11,000. That's a chunk of money.
That is a chunk of that. That's not $3 million, but that is nothing to sniff at. So thank you. Thank you. Testimony right there. Community foundations really do pull through for a lot of libraries. So if it's not a resource you've tapped, it's really worth looking into. And then finally, I have a column for local businesses, and it's kind of a catch-all column. They don't necessarily give grants in the traditional sense, but a lot of times local businesses will be willing to sponsor a project, be it a one-time event or maybe buying some materials or something in return for recognition. Maybe you get a banner for a parade and they have sponsored by XYZ Bank, or maybe you get a cool little display case with materials in your children's section and you have a little plaque about made possible through the donation by. A lot of times real estate agencies, banks, some of these larger community organizations are willing to give money in return for the good publicity and getting their name on something. So again, before I switch out of this slide, I keep harping on local because that's where the vast majority of it comes from. It makes sense because you are fighting a smaller competition pool. You know, if your requirement is that you have to live in a local area, you know, just by definition, you're going up against fewer people. The people who are giving away money tend to want to see it go right back into the community. And it's real easy to argue as a library, hey, we're a great community resource and we have ways to make this happen. So local really are wonderful places to start. Oh, I'm going to interrupt myself here. There is a handout that's going to be released at the end of this along with the LEU. So if I mention any sites, I mentioned the Grantsmanship Center, I'm going to have some other grants and foundations that I bring up. Don't feel like you have to be running to write that down or copy the URLs because it will be available on the handout at the end. So moving up on a slightly larger scale, you can look for funding from the state. So your competition just got a little bit bigger. Now you're competing against all Indiana libraries. So, you know, take a look at your friends. They're now your competitors. But there are some good state institutions or good state organizations that are consistently giving money to Indiana libraries. Indiana Humanities has a wide array of grants. It often changes from year to year, or sometimes it feels like the title changes, but the general concepts are the same, which is that they really want to focus on humanities programming. And there are so many ways that you can bring that into the library. You can do author visits, you can do tie-ins to one book, one read. In fact, those are the two things that they're really known for. We have a lot of libraries that have humanities grants in the past for things like bringing in Indiana authors. Or a couple years back, it was the Frankenstein grants for the statewide Frankenstein read. So a lot of libraries use that. But they have some of those very purposeful grants where, you know, anyone who applies gets money for Frankenstein. But again, if you go on their page, they do have these changing, rotating opportunities. So you may find something that better fits a project that you have in mind. The Indiana Office of Community and Rural Affairs has community development block grants that have often gone to libraries. I am very fond of giving shout outs to them because they are pretty much the only grant that I know that allows for construction. Most grants will put right up front that construction is not an eligible a cost. You can't ask for that. This grant does. Now, I don't know if any of you have plans to, you know, demolish your children's room and build a new one, but you don't have to do construction to apply for these. These are really, how did they put it? Grants to enhance the lives of community members. That's what they're looking for. And again, I think you have a really good argument as children's librarians that that's exactly what you're doing. And there is a history of them providing money for libraries, so that's worth looking into. And then finally, the Indiana Arts Commissions. It's kind of like Indiana Humanities, where it does have a focus and it wants to give money towards programs that really highlight the arts. And I don't even think I need to tell you, there's a bunch of things that I know you guys are dealing with art out there, whether one-time events or long-term projects, installations, things you're bringing to your building. And of course, I mentioned I am the LSTA coordinator for the state, so I would be an awful LSTA coordinator if I didn't give it a shout out. And it gets its own slide because I made this presentation and I said so. But it also gets its own slide because honestly, it is one of the best and most consistent sources of state funding. We usually give between 20 to 40 different subgrants a year. So LSTA is for Library Services and Technology Act. It is technically federal funding. IMLS, or the Institute of Museum and Library Services, every year they get a large pot of money from the federal government. Then they allocate that to all the states and territories depending on your population. It's a pure mathematical equation. And then all the state libraries are free to do with our money with some restrictions what we choose. Some libraries choose to go all statewide services. Some give it to, give the bulk of it to their individual libraries to use on their own. And in Indiana, we do a combination of that. So our statewide services, LSTA projects would be things like Inspire or support of the Talking Book and Braille Library. But we also set aside a pot of money for our subgrants, which are technology and digitization. And I like to tell people, don't talk yourself out of an LSTA grant because you hear technology and you think, this isn't the grant for me. Mine really isn't technology based. You don't have to have like robotics, coding, tablet, STEM, makerspace as part of your project title to make it eligible for a technology grant. Many grant projects do involve technology to some degree, either to facilitate it, as a focal point, or just, again, to keep that program running smoothly. So you may find that your knee-jerk reaction is, not for me, but when you think about it, gosh, having a laptop lab would make that easier. Or gosh, having those hot spots so we could take this on the road would really help. And sometimes people just come up with really cool creative projects that are outside of the box. I'm going to give a couple shout outs. Mishawaka Penn Harris Library a couple years back did a project that revolved around early literacy training for parents, and they applied for grant money to get Starling word counters, which they then used in the training. They talked about the importance of talking, and they were able to pass these out so parents had a real sense of exactly how much or how little they were talking to their kids. The focus of the project was early childhood literacy, but that money went towards a technology purchase. Another one just this year, Peabody Public Library up in Northeast Indiana was just awarded a grant for their wetlands project, which offhand you don't necessarily think wetlands technology, but they really wanted to emphasize programming with this awesome natural resource they have in their backyard. So they have a whole slate of ideas of possible programming for all age, and they got technology to support it. So they have things like underwater drones and night vision goggles, but they're also getting things like microscopes so that kids can look at, things under the slides. A lot of people don't necessarily think microscope when they think technology, but we sure did when we read the application. So that was a good example of really thinking outside the box. So what you see on your screen right now is the LSTA website. There's we talk about the purpose of the technology grant. I won't read that for you. I will mention, I really like promoting the LSTA grants as a good beginner grant. If you've never applied for a grant before, this is probably among the most friendly, willing to hold your hand grant application process you'll ever have. We really want you to succeed at this to the point where we'll look at your application and give you recommendations, and we'll answer questions, not at all hours of the day. I do go home. We'll answer questions from 8 to 4. And, we really want, we are looking for reasons to help you succeed, not for reasons to take you out of the process. So if you're intimidated, even after this webinar about reaching out, this might be a good way to dip your toes in the water. I'm just going to briefly mention federal government grants, and I say briefly because they are harder to come by virtue of federal. You're competing with possibly any other library in the land. IMLS is up there. The vast majority of their grants that they have available for libraries are those LSTA grants, so they're already funded through the state libraries. But if you go to their grants portal on their webpage, they do have some other rotating opportunities. They had something called the Sparks Ignition Grant a few years back that several Indiana libraries were able to make use of. And then they have some pretty much long-standing constant grants, things for professional development, continuing education. So if you'd like people in your department to be able to get to conference or get trainings for things, this might be able to help you out. And then the National Endowment for the Humanities, they also donate money to American libraries. That being said, most of their money, similar to IMLS, is filtered through a state agency. In this case, Indiana Humanities often partners with them or filters their money. So also on a national level, not just federal government, but you can look at national organizations, national companies and corporations. Many of these larger businesses have their own foundations. These are going to be different than your community foundations. So these are the not-for-profit sector of a for-profit business. So I think, everyone knows, I don't think I'm, breaking anyone's illusion here that Walmart is a for-profit business, but they do have an arm that's devoted, their foundation that's devoted to charitable giving. Many of these, as I said, these national chains will have them. Even still, they tend to want to give back to local communities. So a lot of them, if you read through requirements, you'll find that one of the requirements has to deal with proximity. You have to be within this many miles of a Barnes and Noble. You have to have, be within this many miles of our factory, of our store or whatnot. So it's really worth looking at those to make sure that you're going to be eligible from the get-go. And it's also good to know what your community has. If you have, if you don't have a PNC bank in your area, you're probably not going to be eligible for their grants, but you might be eligible for Old National Bank if that's what you have. They also have a grant program. So kind of think about what you actually have in your community, because even though they're big organizations, they really do want to give money locally. And again, there's a chance that these are going to be more competitive than your smaller local grants. On the plus side, if you get one of them, they tend to be not quite as restrictive as government grants as to what you can buy. We unfortunately have a lot of rules. We can't let you buy food with our grants. And as I said, construction is almost never allowed. There's a lot of, we want to give money, but we have to give stipulations. Sometimes those private foundations can be a little more loosey-goosey with the projects. So what you see on your screen now is not an all-inclusive list of corporations that are giving money to libraries in America. This is probably like 1/1,000,000th. But what is on the screen right now are larger corporations that have recently given money within the last couple years to Indiana libraries. So all of these, we've had libraries report that they have successfully applied for grant funding from these organizations and received it, most of them on multiple occasions. Some are larger than others. Deco Foundation is really more of a local one, but it does extend over, I believe, if not a couple states, a good part of the state. Local REMC, it's not a national organization, but they have a lot of locations, and if you have an REMC close to you, they have recently really upped their giving to communities. I'm sure if you're familiar with Walmart, Barnes & Noble. Potash Family Foundation, Believe in Reading, is kind of their website and their grants name. If you're not familiar with the foundation, you probably know their organization. It's the founder of Overdrive. So apparently he's really into giving money back to the library community because they are very active. Their website shows a lot of donations in recent years. So that's a fairly newer addition to our list that is really worth checking out. I'm also going to give a shout out to Dollar General. They get their own slide as well, and I swear I am not on their payroll. I am not getting any sort of side money for this, but it's worth noting because they have reliably and consistently given multiple grants each year to Indiana libraries. And again, it may be a couple $1,000s here or there, but it can really make a difference in a project. They have several literacy grants, pretty much one for any age group you can imagine. There's one for multi-generational, for adults, for teens, for kids. But they also have a grant specifically for summer reading programs. And this is where we find a lot of libraries benefit. A lot of our state libraries get some help for their summer reading program. So if you're strapped for funds, that's a great place to turn. Okay, so what you see on your screen now, since I've spent, a good 20 minutes harping on look local, look local, look local. In 2017, on our annual report that all the state libraries had to submit, we asked a question about what grants have your library received this year? Because, we have libraries self-reporting throughout the year, but we wanted to try to get a more inclusive picture. I can tell you, even putting it on the annual report, the grants were underreported. I know this because I think we had something like 12 people report getting LSTA grants, and we gave out 32. So I know that the grants were underreported. But still, the information we got from there and we put it together on a table, and that link is also going to be on the grants handout. It's a good resource. You can kind of skim through there and see where are other people having success and what ones show up again and again and again. So I took that information and I made a couple slides with it. And if you see something repeated like ALA 3 times at the top here, it means that 3 different libraries reported receiving money from an ALA grant that year. So if it's multiple times, it wasn't a typo, it's meant to be that way. But what you see on this first screen here, these are all of the larger national corporations or companies with a national scope that libraries reported receiving money from. On this screen here, and you see a few more pop up, these are at the state level, and there's my, beloved pet LSTA grants making their show there. You see the Indiana Humanities, that was a big year for the Frankenstein grant. Indiana Arts Commission worked with them for several projects. And then on the final slide, these are your local grants. And CF is Community Foundation, because I just got sick of typing it out. And if you did a find and search for CF on this page, it would just light up the night like a million stars in the sky here. There are so many community foundations that really, again, are the bread and butter of grant projects for Indiana libraries.
That is really impressive and eye-opening, I think. I don't know if everyone realizes just how expansive those community foundations can be.
Well, and I don't think a lot of them necessarily make it very public what they're doing. I think a lot of the onus falls on the library themselves to seek them out, which is a bit of a shame because they can do great things, but if you don't know they're there and you're not looking, you're not able to tap into that.
Oh, one more comment.
Sure.
Excuse me. Julie, again, Julie is the grant queen. So she said ALA Dollar General American Dream Grant was a great way to fund adult and ESL literacy programming. She received $10,000 from them in 2017. She was on the grant panel last year and is happy to help anyone with the application process. That's a really nice offer. Thank you, Julie.
Again, Julie Wendorf?
Yes.
This woman knows what she's talking about. Yes, take her up on that. She's clearly had some success. Let's see. Before I move on to tips, I do want to point out there are some websites and aggregators. So if you don't feel like trying to stay on top of this all by yourself and going to individual sites, there's a list of some where they kind of bring them all together. At the bottom of this list are subscription databases, and some of them are very pricey, and I realize that a lot of libraries are going to have limited to no access to them, but I put them on there anyway because even with subscription services, a lot of times you can get limited but useful information, so you might not be able to apply for a grant directly through their website if you're not paying the subscription price, but you might be able to get a name and you might be able to go to that company's website and actually look it up there and apply on your own. So it's worth seeing maybe if you can kind of sneak some information from them. The other one on this list that I want to point out is the librarygrants.blogspot.com. It is probably the most unassuming one on this list. It doesn't have flashy graphics. It's got blog in the URL, so it's not exactly the hippest, trendiest one out there, but it does a really good job of kind of ferreting out these smaller, lesser known grants, and they stay very up to date, so it's really worth a look for that one. We also have our own grants portal on the Indiana State Library website that, again, we try to keep up to date. If we hear that a grant is no longer being offered, we'll try to remove that. We try to add the new ones as we find it, so it's worth a look there. Okay, looking at doing a time check here. So I'm going to blow through some of this planning to apply, and if you have questions on anything I say, since we're going to have to go through this pretty quickly, again, I just keep stressing, don't hesitate to ask.
And I think you're okay on time. If you
Are we?
need to. Yeah.
Okay.
We can go a little over 45.
So says you. We'll see what they say. So hopefully after this first half, you have some ideas of where you might want to look for grants. So let's skip ahead to your happy future and say that you have identified potential funders. So before you dive into that application, you're excited, you're ready to go, but there is some preparation work you can do to really make it easier for yourself. Right out of the gate, you might want to consider, depending on your project or need, if a partnership would be a good idea. There are lots of advantages to partnerships beyond the obvious. There's more people to share the work. It creates more opportunities a lot of the times, by which I mean by virtue of partnering up, you might make yourself eligible for grants you wouldn't otherwise be eligible for. And I'm going to use an example from the state library that's kind of the reverse of this. But with our LSTA digitization grant, you have to be a library to apply for that. However, if you're a museum or a historical center or, some smaller non-library organization that partners with a library, all of a sudden your project can get funded because you are working, you've got that library backing you, we're comfortable knowing that there's that library connection and you're working together. And that's how a lot of our digitization grants work, is that a library is willing to take these organizations, on side to get this project done. And the same can be true for libraries, where you may not necessarily get your foot in the door on your own, but if you partner up with a different charitable organization, you'll have more opportunities. It's also really appealing to future potential funders because it provides some stability. The more people who are on board, the less chance that you're going to flake out on the grant and just disappear mid-grant and never submit paperwork and fall off the face of the earth. The more established partners are in it, the more likely they're going to see some return for their investment. And especially considering how many of these local organizations really want the money to stay in the community, it's such a great argument to be able to say, hey, not only do we have the library, but we have the Boys and Girls Club. So we're reaching two audiences right there at minimum. So again, it's something worth considering. It doesn't work in all situations, but if you have these good relationships, it's a great way to tackle a grant. If you haven't already made yourself familiar with outcome-based planning and evaluation, I recommend you do so before you start any grant. So besides just thinking about your project, you really do have to think about what the outcome of your project is. And traditionally, grants have asked for projected outputs. So tell us how many, give us a quantitative success rate, give us a number. How many people do you think are going to attend a program? How many people are you going to reach? How many of these items are going to circulate during the grant period? Give us an estimation. But in more recent years, places are asking you to take that a step further. Outcomes answer the question of why those numbers are important. So what's the impact? So for example, an output would be, X number of people will attend our early literacy classes. The outcome would be, and hopefully we'll be educating these young parents more and will really help close that word gap that's really pronounced that we see, talked about in literature all the time. Or you can say as an output that we project we're going to have, we anticipate having 10 programs with these tablets for kids in this age range, and we're hoping we have a total of 50 kids show up. And the outcome would be, we are hoping to have a total of 50 kids show up so that we can encourage hands-on digital literacy and make them more comfortable with this new technology, and maybe even make them interested in STEM. Now, it may feel like sometimes you're taking it a step further than you're used to, or even maybe a little further than you're comfortable with. And if you start writing down things like, and this will solve world hunger, you've probably gone too far. But it's not out of line to say things like, this is going to help with digital literacy, or we have this, gap in STEM classes, and this might get people interested, because you may know that as a librarian, but the grant review panel is not necessarily a librarian. Things that are obvious to you, like this is important and this is what we need to work on, aren't necessarily obvious to them. So help get them there. If everything I'm talking about is unfamiliar or kind of scary, or if you need a refresher, there is a fantastic learning module about this on IMLS's website. It is completely free. It is completely self-guided. You can log in. You can do it in 5-minute increments over, several days. You can just sit down and plow through it at once. But it walks you through this. It gives examples, and it is geared towards libraries specifically. I cannot recommend this enough. Next up, do your homework. So other preparation you'll want to do. Read descriptions of previous winners. Almost every granting agency is going to have a website somewhere where they have a link to past winners or past projects funded, and it's really valuable to take a look at that. You'll see what they've been funding in the past as far as like what do they have a proclivity towards funding. You'll kind of get a sense maybe of whether your project fits in with what they like, or whether maybe you'd be best looking for a different grantor. Maybe it's not a great fit. But also, you could get some ideas for cool projects down the road. And some of them will even go so far as to put the application of winning projects up there. And if that's the case, it's a really nice opportunity to get to read some award-winning grants, see what they're doing that makes them successful. On the homework front is maybe doing a little research to back up those outcomes that you're reaching for in your grant. If you talk in your needs assessment or in your project goals, if you talk about, this is really important for our community because this is an impoverished area and we know that kids today don't have a lot of access to this technology or this equipment, that's fantastic. But if you can go on to say, and we know that it's an impoverished area because X percentage of kids are receiving free and reduced lunch, and that's really higher than the national average, that's even more compelling. You've given people a concrete number to make your case, and it also shows that you went that extra step to do some homework and put that legwork in, and extra effort is always a good thing. That being said, don't feel like you have to throw numbers at the wall and see what sticks. Don't plaster your application with numbers just for the heck of it. You may find an awesome article on literacy or virtual reality or whatever, and it has a lot of great information. And maybe there's one statistic that can help you out and 19 that are really cool but not relevant. You're going to have to let those 19 go. Just keep them in your brain for conversational fodder at some point, but don't put them in your application. Okay, so assuming you've done your legwork and you're ready to sit down and put your pen to the paper, or I guess your mouse cursor in the field, you are ready to go. So the process itself, number one thing I will tell you, and it's going to seem so obvious right there on your screen, read the guidelines. And this is not meant to be condescending. This is from someone who has been at this job for only 2 years, but has seen quite a few examples of people who have obviously been excited, gotten ahead of themselves, and missed something really important in the guidelines. You'll want to read them because somewhere in the guidelines it's going to give you conditions of eligibility, and there is no reason for you to put a ton of work into a really well thought out grant application only to find out, oh, we're not in the service area, or oh, we had a grant last year and we have to wait 3 years between grant cycles, or oh, they just don't like applications from people named Julie, which apparently is not the case. But so you'll want to make sure it's eligible, because I've received ones for projects that weren't. Or, or you're asking for money for things that aren't eligible. If as an LSTA grant or review person, if someone asks me for pizza after we specifically state in the guidelines that we cannot fund food as part of our expenses, I'm going to know, one, I can't fund this project, and two, somebody didn't read through the guidelines. They'll also give you information about if there's supplemental material you need to turn in, and this is another thing that a lot of people in their eagerness to get done will overlook. They'll turn in the application and then they won't click on the link that says, also fill out this extra worksheet with questions. And some places, here at the State Library, if we catch that, we'll contact you and say, hey, maybe you forgot that and would like to turn that in. Some places aren't going to be quite so understanding, and they'll say, oh, well, it's not complete, it goes in the no pile. So, don't shoot yourself in the foot before you even get a chance. And then finally, it may not be obvious who's done all the work up front, but it's going to be pretty obvious who hasn't. So again, just put your best foot forward. It's really easy to read those directions and catch anything important like that. In creating a work plan, almost all applications will have somewhere in there a section for activities or a process or agenda. It has different names, but it's essentially give us an idea of what you're doing, lay out the process for us. It usually doesn't come till later in the application. If it does, I recommend you kind of work on this from the get-go, because as you work on it, it's going to really help you understand and maybe catch some things you wouldn't before. As you're laying out the process, you may say, oh my gosh, I forgot. If we ask for this in our budget, we're going to need this accessory. Or, ooh, I need to contact so-and-so over at the school if I'm going to assume that she lets me do a presentation over there. So if you work on that process ahead of time, you may save yourself some problems down the road. Also, I mentioned on here, be conscious as to what happens prior, during, and following the grant period. You really want to keep an eye towards when grants start and when they finish, because this only works if you make this purchase at this time when the sale is on or when you have access to it, and that's prior to a grant starting, they can't reimburse you. There are no flexibilities as far as grant start dates for the most part. And similarly, if you're saying, we're going to do this really cool project in the year 2021 using what we get here, that's awesome, but we're looking for the grant period that's happening now and it ends in 2020. So kind of keep an eye as to what exactly is happening during that grant period. Be very familiar and comfortable with your budget. Almost all grants are going to have some sort of cost sharing requirement, and do not let this intimidate you, because usually the grants that require cost sharing will also let you count staff work towards that cost sharing. So you may say, there's no way I can come up with 50% or 10% or 5% of the cost that I'm asking for. But then you think, well, gosh, what's my salary? And how much time have I spent working on this project? And how much do I project I'm going to work on it? And about how many, how much does that come to? And it's amazing how fast it will add up. So don't get worried by cost, be aware of them and make sure that you've planned for them, but don't let cost share scare you off. I mentioned remembering incidentals, and this is where that budgeting or the activities can really help you. If you're asking for, say, iPads for something, especially for kids, you'll probably want to ask for protective cases to go with them, and maybe some additional chargers or a charging cart so you can take it on the go. If you're asking for Legos, maybe you want tubs to store them in, or something really cool you can use to display them. So think about things that tie into your project that you might want to add to that budget. Having said that, don't get so greedy that it kind of makes people look at you askance. Most grants, all grants, are going to have an upper limit to them. And if you have a legit need for all 10,000 or 20,000 or 3,000 or whatever that limit is, fantastic. Justify it, put it out there. But if you find yourself going, wow, this grant goes up to 10,000 and my project is only 8,000, so I really want an underwater drone, I'm going to tack that on there, it's going to look really suspect if your project has to do with early literacy and underwater drone. It looks like you tacked it on there, it doesn't look relevant, and someone's going to say, is this really a project or is this just a money grab? So make sure that what you're asking for sticks to your central project. Title, opening paragraph, and description. I just wanted to mention on these that depending on how many people apply for a grant, depending on how many people are reviewing your grant, these really become the most important part in a lot of ways, in that some people may only get a chance to read these before it gets passed on to someone else. So you want to make it count. As far as titles go, colons and semicolons are your friends. Maybe not in newspaper headlines or in the rest of the world, but for this process, it's really helpful. So if you can say something specific and explain the purpose of your grant in one title, that's fantastic. So for example, rather than grant for digital camera, if you call it lights, camera, action, colon, using video production to teach information assessment skills. Okay, that's a mouthful, but anyone reading the title knows you don't just want a digital camera, you want to use it to teach people. So how much cooler is that? Or circulating Wi-Fi hotspots to provide student access in rural areas. That lets people know you don't just want to pass them out because they're a cool new trendy thing, but there's probably issues with access in your area. And if you keep reading this application, maybe there's even some statistics to back that up. Make sure that all of your really relevant information is in that opening paragraph. You want to put your name, what you want the money for, and again, why it's so important up front. You want this, what is that outcome you're looking for? To help fight for literacy, to help increase digital awareness, to help bring our library into the 20th century, whatever it's for. Make sure that takes a prominent place, because again, if someone's just reviewing them up front and then sorting grants into piles or applications into piles, you want to make sure everything they need is in the same place. And again, with project description, I've already mentioned this, but make sure you talk about the significance. Don't just say, I want XYZ. It's, I want XYZ because it's going to have this awesome impact on our community.
Not a laundry list of
Exactly.
items.
Exactly. We're getting towards the end here, so good, we're pretty much right on time. Hang with me, we've just got a couple more slides. Make sure you have appropriate support. Again, I've only been doing this from my end, from the grantor end, for a couple years, and I know for at least the past 3 years, at least one grant has been forfeited after someone went to all the work of turning it in, writing a great grant, getting approved, having us send them the hooray, you got the money letter, only to have them contact us later and say, yeah, so it turns out I'm not allowed to accept the money. I didn't go through my director. I didn't go through the grants coordinator. I didn't go through, the overlord and master who sees all things money. Whatever it is, make sure that you know who has to give you permission, to sign off on a project before you go for funding, and that you have that, because it's got to be an awful feeling to get that money and then have to give it back. And again, it could hurt your chances for future grants, because maybe the next year you apply from the same grantor and this time you have that approval, but people may have that memory of like, oh, we gave them last year and they gave it right back. I don't know if they had their act together. Hopefully not. I know that we don't hold it against people. I don't, I can't vouch for everyone. So just make sure to get that permission ahead of time. Be sure to ask for help when you need it. Asking for outside help as far as reading your grant is a great thing, because especially with all that I've been harping on, go for local grants, go for community grants, don't go for library grants. That means that non-library people will likely be reading your application. So things that are obvious to you, shorthand that's obvious to you, SRP, SLP, well, we all know what that is. Somebody reading it may not. Or when we talk about, the 5 foundations of every child ready to read, they're not going to know what that is. So make sure you keep your audience in mind, and having someone who's not in the profession read it and say, yeah, whatever's in your head didn't make it to the paper. That can be really helpful. And the other thing, as far as asking goes, don't be afraid to reach out to the granting organization. They'll be happy to answer questions about the grant and clarify things. Some, such as us here at the State Library, will go so far as to tell you can submit an application early for review and get feedback and adjust it. We let people do that as many times as they can before they, the application process is up. I've had people, last year I had someone maybe submit 3 drafts before they submitted the final one. And let me tell you, my thought process was not, oh my gosh, go away, but it was, wow, this person really wants it and is really committed to doing what it takes to secure this funding. And if they're working this hard on the application, I bet they're going to work pretty hard on the project. And yes, they did get funded. And when I sat with the review committee, the first thing I said was, these guys really want it and they're working hard for it. So don't feel like asking is going to hurt your chances or make it look like you don't know what you're doing. And finally, apply again. Grants are competitive, and even the best written grants sometimes just don't make it for whatever reason during the year. Usually you can ask a grant review panel or the grantor after the fact if there's anything you can do to make your grant better for future years or for future applications, and they'll share with you if there's anything that stood out. Sometimes it really isn't. Sometimes it's just, it was a competitive field and this wasn't as compelling as others. And sometimes it may be, hey, yeah, you didn't submit the supplemental materials, or it doesn't really match our agency. So they can maybe give you some insight. So take it, use it. Don't hesitate to try again with the same project with someone else. I will say, if you're applying again and again and again for the same project, and you are using the same wording and you are just cutting and pasting it into applications, you are likely doing something wrong. If it's so generic that you can just drop it into a field without making any tweaks whatsoever, you may want to take a look at what you're writing and see if there's any way you can really alter it to make it speak to that particular funder. What did they say their goals were? What was important to them? And then add a sentence or two about how this is really going to bring intergenerational community togetherness. Speak to what they want. And it doesn't mean you have to rewrite it from scratch, but again, if you're not changing a thing, then you might want to rethink that. And then finally, that's my contact information right there. I'm sure you figured out I wasn't lying when I said I like to talk, so feel free to contact me. There's going to be some chat, I think.
If anybody has any questions, go ahead and start typing those into the box. And Julie did have one more thing to say, Angela, which I will now share with the group. She said that their community foundation had a big idea grant that was worth $100,000, and their project proposal totaled just $77,000. So they were actually awarded that grant because, as a result, the grantors were able to give a second grant to another organization for $25,000 because they were the only group, they said, that did not ask for the
entire
whole amount. Yeah, so they probably had a leg up because they realized they could help two organizations.
And again, when you come in under that maximum amount, it tends to give the impression that what you're asking for is only what's needed. Clearly. And there are good reasons to ask for maximum amounts, but if your project really doesn't require it and you turn in that budget detailing it, someone's going to say, oh, well, they have very good reasons for asking for this, and it's not a laundry list of wants, it's not a money grub, they have really a strong purpose for each and every item on there. And, hopefully you get a happy ending and you get somebody saying, yeah, let's go ahead and give it to them. I mean, Julie's example is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it didn't hurt that they could say, oh, that leaves us money to help somebody else.
Yeah.
What a great outcome.
So I see a few people typing, but none of their questions have popped up yet. Let's see. Let me make sure that I am all the way. Yeah. Give them one moment to see if they're going to actually ask a question or if they're typing something else. Ah, here we go. Sarah says, will the PowerPoint slides be shared with us? It's a really good presentation and I'd love to be able to reference it later on. Sarah, we have a resource handout that you will be able to download, which basically contains all of the information. If you individually really want those slides, why don't you send an email to Angela and she can send that to you. And her email's right up there. It's ANFOX, as in Angela Fox, at library.in.gov.
I will also mention, if you are interested in this topic, if you think, wow, I wish some people in my department could see this, or it would be helpful to see this presentation again, I have done variations of this on site as a library consultant. So if it's something that you might be interested in, I have on occasion gone out to libraries and they gave me a time and a day and I showed up and I did my little song and dance and answered questions in person and hit the road on the way back. So if that's something you're considering, reach out to me. I love to do those sort of things. It's fun to go out there and see your libraries.
Yeah, and you can always invite other libraries from nearby, right? And
absolutely. We love that. That's more bang for our buck. We get to meet more people.
Yeah.
So.
We did have a question from Jennifer. She said, how do you find good grant ideas? I work in a small rural library that I know could benefit from grants, but I can't decide what kind of project would have the most impact. And as a result, I haven't pursued any. That's a really good.
That is an excellent question. I mentioned it real fast in passing, and I should probably emphasize some more. I actually think some of the best ideas, professional literature, when you scan through stuff, they'll talk about things, and that's really cool. But I find some of the best ideas are if you go to some of these grantee websites, if you go to the LSTA site and you click on the link for past winners, if you go to that Big Reading Ideas Potash Foundation, they've got a beautiful website of projects past funded, and you can see not only what they are funding, but as I said, it can give you some really cool ideas where you're just like, whoa, okay, yeah, I see why they asked for that. That's really cool. That's really, and some of them are completely innovative and out of left field, and some it might be a case of like, I didn't know I could ask for that. That's such a basic need and it would do so much good, but it's not flashy. I just didn't think of it, but I can ask for that. So you may get stuff that's completely out of left field you've never considered. You may get things that could do a lot of good that you just didn't realize. It's less flashy, it's not going to show up in American Library Journal, or a Library Journal or American, you know what I'm saying. Yeah. Anyway, looking at those pages with past grantees, I do find that you can get some really cool ideas. I always say, anytime I do a presentation, I'm like, if you have specific questions or want to reach out to people, the listserv is a great idea. But I'm telling you, the collective wisdom on those public listservs is amazing. And I have just found librarians are the most generous people with their ideas and their knowledge. They're not hoarding that to themselves. They want to get it out there. So if you want to reach out and say to a listserv, hey, I'm toying with the idea of getting a grant. Can you tell me some successful ones you've had or ideas you have that might be worth pursuing? Somebody might have a really great idea or a really successful one that you might be able to duplicate at your library.
I would also suggest, for sure, looking what other people are doing, asking what they're doing. If you have the opportunity to go visit nearby libraries, especially larger libraries who they might be doing some really innovative things because they just have the resources to do it. See what they're doing and think about how you might do it on a smaller scale. And maybe that might direct you to a great project. We had one other comment from Tina, and she just said, thanks for the info. And their community has a Little Big Ideas grant that's up to $1,000, and she's excited to apply for it now. So yay, go forth and apply. I think at this time, you guys, if you continue to have questions, you can type them in the inbox or in the chat box, sorry. I'm going to stop recording the webinar right now. So again, you're in the future and you're watching this webinar as a recording, then the instructions for getting your LEU certificate are in the video description on YouTube, and the resource sheet handout we've been talking about, I'm going to make that available on the archived webinar page where this webinar will be stored. But those of you who are here live, stay on the line and we will get you your LEU here. Just one moment.